In Rome, power was measured not by marble, but by ownership. For every victory parade, there was a caravan of captives, girls barely 13, branded and sold as proof of conquest. Their names vanished, but their labor built the empire's splendor. These were not the shadows of Rome. They were its foundation. The law called them res humanae, human things, bought, bred, and broken to serve the civilized. So when we speak of Rome's greatness, we must ask, whose lives paid for it? If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The story of Rome's greatness begins where its records fall silent, in the cries of the conquered. When the legions marched through Gaul, Judea, Britannia, or Asia Minor, the triumphs celebrated in marble were built on flesh. After each campaign, prisoners were counted, divided, and classified like goods. Young girls, often between 10 and 15, were separated from their families and added to the Preda Humana, human booty. They were the most valuable spoils of victory, their youth a currency that the empire never stopped minting. The law made it official. Under Ius Gentium, the law of nations, any person captured in war automatically became the property of the victor. There was no trial, no defense, no appeal, only ownership. To Rome, conquest itself was the contract. The empire's jurists described this as natural order. The strong rule, the weak serve. Cicero wrote that victory makes right, a phrase that to Roman merchants meant one thing: profit. In the camps that followed conquest, administrators recorded each captive by age, sex, and value. In some surviving tablets, the notation puella tin an appears beside a price in denarii, girl, 13 years old. Those records are not myths, they are receipts. A child could be sold for less than a hunting dog, yet yield decades of unpaid labor. Once taken, the girls were marched for weeks toward coastal markets. Some died along the way from exhaustion or assault. Others arrived in chains, branded with iron marks showing their new master's initials. The Roman historian Tacitus noted that during Titus's triumph over Judea in 70 CE, Jewish girls were paraded in fetters behind the chariots of generals, living trophies of victory. To the conquerors, these processions symbolized civilization's expansion. To the enslaved, they were processions of erasure. Their native clothes were stripped, their names Latinized or erased, their languages banned. From that moment forward, they were no longer daughters, sisters, or citizens. They were property recorded in ledgers, taxed by the state, and traded in markets. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of this machinery. Slave collars discovered near Pompeii bear inscriptions such as "Teneme nefugiam et revocame ad dominum meum," "Hold me, lest I flee, and return me to my master." Such phrases were not metaphors. They were daily realities strapped around human throats. Rome's monuments proclaim justice, order, and reason. But beneath every inscription lies another truth. The empire's glory was paid for in lives it refused to count as human. And for the girls who survived the march, the worst was still ahead. The market awaited, the place where civilization turned ownership into spectacle. The slave market was where Rome's victories turned into profit. Every conquest, whether in Gaul, Judea, or Britannia, ended the same way. The parade of generals above, the auction of captives below. The empire's power wasn't just celebrated in temples, it was tallied in coins. At the Forum Boarium, once a cattle market, human trade became daily routine. At dawn, buyers gathered under marble arches. Rows of children stood waiting, eyes fixed on the ground. The younger they were, the higher the price. Girls were especially prized, useful, obedient, and profitable. Roman law didn't hide this system, it refined it. The Edilician Edict required that slaves be displayed and inspected before sale. Transparency, the Romans called it. Girls were placed on a raised platform, the catasta, forced to stand exposed, while merchants listed their details on a small board. Age, 13. Origin, Gaul, speaks Latin, obedient. Each was tagged like property in a warehouse. The historian Pliny called these markets necessary for the state. Cicero wrote that victory makes right. To the empire, this was order, conquest, feeding commerce, commerce feeding glory. But beneath that logic was an open wound. Each transaction was the erasure of a human being. Graffiti and tablets from Pompeii still record the trade. One reads simply, sold. One girl, 12, Cappadocian, for 4,000 sesterces. That line on a ledger replaced an entire life. Even the taxes were standardized. 4% of every sale went to the state. The money that built aqueducts and amphitheaters came from the sale of children. Rome did not hide its cruelty, it accounted for it. The process was calculated. Before each auction, slaves were washed, perfumed, and sometimes forced to smile. The goal was to create the illusion of docility. Buyers examined them like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, and scars. Resistance lowered value. A whip was cheaper than pity. A girl of 13 might sell for the yearly pay of a soldier. If she could sing, play an instrument, or speak a few words of Latin, her price doubled. Skill was luxury. Innocence was premium. These were not isolated acts of greed. They were state-sanctioned rituals. Markets existed across the empire. Delos, Corinth, Carthage, Ephesus. Everywhere, the same structure. Walls enclosing platforms, guards watching the exits, scribes recording sales. The system worked because it was efficient, not because it was hidden. Rome's writers described it as natural. Seneca argued that hierarchy was divine order, some born to rule, others to serve. The empire's conscience rested on philosophy. Its wealth rested on suffering. When Roman citizens passed the markets, they didn't see cruelty. They saw stability. But for the girls standing on those platforms, the market was the end of the world. Stripped, renamed, and traded, they lost everything that made them visible. Many were given new names: Flavia, Pupa, Livia, chosen not for meaning but for obedience. In a single sale, a person became a possession. Archaeological finds reveal the cold precision of that system. Iron collars inscribed with phrases like, "Hold me lest I flee, and return me to my master," were found buried near villas. These weren't punishments, they were identification tags. The state turned fear into paperwork. And this trade was vast. Historians estimate that during the 1st century CE, nearly 1 in 5 people in Rome was enslaved. The empire called it civilization. The enslaved called it survival. For the girls, the market was only the beginning. After the sale came transport, carried to villas, farms, or brothels, depending on the buyer's needs. Some went to serve noble women, others to raise children not their own. A few would never see daylight again. Each sale repeated the same illusion. That order required cruelty. The buyers spoke of law, virtue, and family honor while purchasing children. It was not secrecy that preserved the system. It was language. Rome turned ownership into duty, obedience into virtue, and silence into proof of civilization. By the end of the day, the market fell quiet. The platforms were washed, the coins collected, and the girls led away in chains. To the city, it was another transaction closed. To history, it was the quietest scream Rome ever recorded. Tomorrow, new ships would arrive, new captives would be sold, the empire would grow richer. And behind every wall of marble, the sound of chains would echo beneath the triumphal hymns. Next comes the house, the final theatre of control, where every gesture, word, and breath would belong to someone else. The market ended in chains, but the household began the real imprisonment. For young girls sold into Roman villas, the walls that glittered with gold were their new cages. Rome called it domus, the home. For them, it was a private empire ruled by one man, the paterfamilias, the father of the house, who held absolute power, not only over property, but over life itself. The girls entered this world not as servants, but as possessions. From the moment they crossed the threshold, their existence was reduced to function, to serve, obey, and disappear. They lit lamps, fetched water, dressed mistresses, polished marble floors until the stone reflected their faces back at them, faces they could no longer recognize. Every Roman household was a mirror of the state. Hierarchy, order, and fear governed both. The paterfamilias represented the emperor in miniature. He could command, punish, or kill, all within the law. Seneca admitted it plainly. We abuse slaves as if they were not men, or in practice they were treated as tools, replaceable, voiceless, necessary. In elite homes, girls often served women of high status. They helped with baths, hair, jewelry, and children. But luxury didn't mean safety. A single mistake, spilling oil, breaking glass, speaking too softly or too loud, could trigger violence. Punishment wasn't just correction, it was ritual. A lash meant reminder. A silence meant survival. The daily rhythm was unending. At dawn, they prepared the atrium, tended fires, folded linens. By night, they stood behind couches during banquets, waiting for the nod to pour wine or retreat. They ate leftovers after their masters. They slept in kitchens, storage rooms, or at the foot of beds. Even in sleep, they were available. For the wealthy, obedience was beauty. A quiet slave signaled good breeding. A fearful one proved control. The Roman poet Juvenal mocked mistresses who beat their maids in rage, but even his satire assumed the right to do so. The cruelty wasn't scandal, it was culture. Some girls were used for more intimate service. Historical letters and graffiti hint at a blurred boundary between domestic and sexual labor. The same hands that poured wine were often demanded in other ways. The law didn't call it assault, it called it access. Dominium gave a master not just ownership of a slave's labor, but of her body. The girl's silence was her only form of resistance, and even that could be punished. Over time, the house trained them to erase themselves. They learned to read expressions, predict moods, and vanish before anger arrived. The perfect slave was the one who seemed not to exist. Rome's philosophers called this disciplina, the cultivation of virtue through obedience. To the enslaved, it was survival through invisibility. Archaeology provides small glimpses of these invisible lives. Child-sized sandals found in storerooms, iron shackles in villa basements, graffiti scratched in hidden corners with faint Latin words, serva sum, vivere timeo. I am a slave, I fear to live. These fragments are all that remain of millions who served without being seen. Even the architecture betrayed control. In villas across Campania, rooms for slaves were windowless and connected by narrow corridors. Their design kept servants close enough to answer but far enough to remain unseen. The house itself was a machine for obedience. And yet, through that silence, a kind of language persisted. Some girls carved small symbols, flowers, initials, prayers, onto the undersides of staircases. They marked time in secret, counting days by scratches on stone. For them, survival wasn't living, it was remembering. Rome's moralists liked to say the household was sacred, that within its walls dwelled discipline, loyalty, and faith. But those virtues were built on domination. The same empire that preached order to the world practiced tyranny at home. For a young slave, every corridor echoed with two truths. Rome was eternal, and she was temporary. Her body kept its beauty for others. Her hands built comfort for strangers. Her name belonged to the dead. The law didn't need to silence her. The routine did it perfectly. Still, the system depended on obedience, and obedience had limits. Some resisted quietly, breaking tools, hiding food, teaching others native songs. Others sought the unthinkable, escape. But in Rome, a runaway slave was branded with the letters Fug, Fugitivus, a mark burned into flesh that said, I tried to be human. For most, there was no running, only endurance. And as the empire grew richer, its villas multiplied, each one a private theatre of servitude. From the outside, they stood as symbols of civilization. Inside, they whispered its price. Because what Rome called domestic order was, in truth, an invisible war, between memory and erasure, between obedience and self. And the smallest act of disobedience, a whisper, a hesitation, could end that fragile balance. Next comes punishment, the public face of private control, where fear became education and pain became policy. Rome's cruelty did not survive by passion, it survived by paperwork. Every act of domination, every sale, every punishment was framed, justified, and archived through law. The empire's brutality wasn't chaos, it was administration. Under Aius Gentium, the law of nations, anyone captured in war became property by default. The legal phrase was precise, ex captivitate servitus. Slavery arises from captivity. A girl's loss of freedom wasn't an accident, it was a legal event. The jurist Ulpian later wrote that the moment of capture was the moment of transformation, from person to thing. This transformation was irreversible, without consent from the owner or the emperor. Law became theology. To question it was to question order itself. Aristotle had once argued that some people were natural slaves, bodies made to serve minds. Roman jurists adopted that idea and turned it into doctrine. The result was a legal system that could treat violence as virtue. The dominium, absolute ownership, gave masters full control over the enslaved body. That right included use, sale, punishment, and even execution. A slave could not testify, sue, or marry. Her existence depended entirely on the will of her owner. The state's only concern was property value. If a master killed his slave without cause, it was waste, not murder. The law treated human life as an investment. Rome's famous 12 Tables, foundation of Western jurisprudence, already hinted at this thinking. They didn't defend equality, they defined hierarchy. Whatever is done by the owner to his slave shall be lawful, the text declares. The empire that built law itself used it to strip humanity from millions. What made this system so powerful was its respectability. The same senators who debated ethics and rhetoric in the Forum also issued decrees on slave control. Lex Fufia Caninia limited the number of slaves one could free in a will, not to protect the slaves, but to protect the market. Freedom was a commodity. Too much of it could destabilize prices. In the Roman mind, law was not the opposite of cruelty. It was its disguise. Punishment wasn't vengeance, but procedure. Obedience wasn't virtue, but evidence of ownership. When Seneca wrote, "The wise man rules even when he commands slaves," he meant it literally. Power was moral because it was organized. Even the terminology enforced distance. A slave was res mancipi, a thing that could be transferred like land, livestock, or tools. Legal contracts used the same verbs: tradere, to hand over, vendere, to sell. No differentiation between flesh and stone. To sign a sale was to erase a person. Inscriptions on tombs tell how deeply this logic ran. Some freedwomen called themselves Liberta Liviae, the freedwoman of Livia. Even in death, identity was defined through ownership. The empire that conquered continents couldn't imagine freedom without possession. The economic scale was staggering. In some provinces, slaves made up half the population. Their labor built aqueducts, staffed households, plowed fields, mined silver, and raised children who would never know their names. Roman law turned this vast apparatus into a single idea: stability. To change it would have meant dismantling the economy itself. Archaeological discoveries from Ostia show legal tablets listing slave births, recorded like livestock registers. The owner's name came first, the mother's name second, the infant's gender last. No mention of fatherhood, because under Roman law, an enslaved child had none. The state acknowledged only property lineage, not human one. That bureaucratic coldness created a paradox. Rome's laws, admired for their logic and precision, were also instruments of annihilation. Every principle of order required an act of erasure. To maintain the peace of the empire, the law needed silence, and silence was its most obedient subject. For the enslaved, speaking truth meant rebellion. For the master, cruelty meant legality. Between them stood parchment, the empire's moral shield. Centuries later, modern legal systems would inherit Rome's logic. The idea that legality and morality can be separate, that injustice can wear the face of order. But for the girls who lived under it, law was not philosophy, it was the chain itself. One inscription from a freedwoman's grave reads, "To the gods of the dead, from Amemone, once a slave, now free, who served faithfully." Even in freedom, her epitaph performs obedience. Law had done its final work. It taught the oppressed to speak in the language of their owners. Because in Rome, justice was never about mercy, it was about control. The empire didn't need to hide its violence. It only needed to legislate it. Next comes the lesson that law could never teach, the psychology of obedience, how fear became discipline and punishment became Rome's most effective education. In Rome, punishment was not disorder, it was education. The empire believed fear could teach obedience better than virtue ever could. Inside villas and estates, every lash, every silence, every trembling gesture was part of a larger curriculum, the schooling of subservience. The familia, Rome's basic social unit, was structured like the state itself. Hierarchy on every level, mercy on none. At its center stood the paterfamilias, whose power was both legal and divine. Roman law called it vitae necisque potestas, the right of life and death. It wasn't metaphor. A father could kill his child or slave without trial. What mattered was not the act, but the authority behind it. For the enslaved, this power was absolute. The smallest act could be punished. A late response, a broken cup, an unguarded expression. The punishment didn't have to fit the crime. Its purpose was to remind everyone who ruled. The philosopher Seneca, himself a slave owner, wrote that cruelty was a failure of reason. Yet even he advised moderation in punishment, not its abolition. To Rome, pain was not moral collapse, it was management. Discipline maintained the illusion of order, and fear kept the machine of obedience running without end. Descriptions from Roman letters and satires expose the normalization of violence. Pliny the Younger mentioned how overseers kept whips ready to maintain diligence. Juvenal mocked women who ordered servants flogged between cosmetics and conversation. For them, torture was domestic routine. The punishments themselves were carefully choreographed. Light offenses earned lashes. Heavier ones meant chaining, branding, or public humiliation. Runaways were marked with the letters fugitivus, a permanent scar announcing betrayal. Those accused of theft or defiance could be forced to wear iron collars engraved with commands. "If you find me, return me to my master." Rome turned pain into paperwork, control into inscription. Inside the household, this violence was theatrical. A girl might be made to kneel in front of others as the mistress listed her failures aloud, a ritual of degradation disguised as correction. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was performance. The household became a stage where the enslaved learned to fear, and the masters learned to feel justified. Public punishment served another function: spectacle. In large estates, disobedient slaves were whipped in courtyards for others to see. The message was clear: discipline is survival, defiance is death. It was pedagogy by terror, a method so effective that even free servants imitated the submission of slaves. Archaeological findings confirm this hierarchy of fear. Chains found in domestic cellars, small stocks for limbs, even iron masks, tools designed to silence rather than kill. Rome didn't need to slaughter daily. It only needed to remind the body of its boundaries. The psychological cost was immense. Over time, slaves learned to anticipate violence, to preempt pain by perfecting stillness. Historians call this the culture of obedience. Psychologists today might call it trauma conditioning. The body learned to obey before the mind could think. But beneath that silence simmered rebellion. Some girls deliberately underperformed, broke small objects, or feigned illness as acts of invisible defiance. Others whispered old songs, preserving identity where speech was forbidden. Resistance in Rome rarely shouted, it endured. Even the empire's thinkers sensed the contradiction. How could Rome call itself the world's teacher while ruling by fear? Yet the moralists answered their own question. Fear was civilization. Control was proof of strength. To them, mercy was weakness, and suffering was order made visible. The result was a society where cruelty felt logical. Pain became proof of belonging. Obedience, proof of virtue. Rome didn't need to invent new gods. It had already made law its deity and fear its priesthood. For young enslaved girls, this system shaped every thought. Their lives became lessons in caution. Never meet a gaze too long. Never speak unless called. Never hope for fairness. Survival depended on calculation, how to appear useful enough to keep, invisible enough to be safe. The moral illusion was complete. The empire that carved justice on its monuments practiced domination at home. Its philosophers praised reason while perfecting control. And its greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but anticipation. The knowledge that pain could arrive at any time for any reason and that it would always be legal. The pedagogy of fear did more than preserve obedience. It manufactured identity. It taught the enslaved that submission was their nature, and taught the masters that cruelty was their duty. In that way, the system replicated itself endlessly, each generation inheriting not just power, but the logic that justified it. Because in Rome, punishment didn't end with pain, it ended with belief. When those who suffer begin to think they deserve it, the system no longer needs chains. Next comes desire, the silent economy within the household, where domination turned intimate, and the body itself became Rome's most controlled territory. Rome disguised domination as intimacy. Behind closed doors, where no law reached and no record remained, the logic of ownership extended to the body itself. The same empire that worshipped virtue and order also legislated access, turning desire into another instrument of control. The Roman household was built for this duality: public morality above, private possession below. A slave girl served her mistress by day, her master by night. The law made no distinction. Under dominium, her body was property, and property could be used. There was no such thing as consent, only availability. Writers of the time spoke of it casually. Martial joked about masters borrowing beauty from their own households. Ovid wrote poems of seduction that blurred the line between affection and coercion. None questioned the ethics of power, they celebrated its reach. To the Roman mind, dominance was not shameful, it was proof of civilization. Within the villas, the girls' bodies became silent ledgers of hierarchy. The master's pleasure reaffirmed his authority. The mistress's jealousy reaffirmed her control. Even intimacy was politics. To touch was to own. To resist was to risk annihilation. Some households institutionalized this access. The cubiculum servile, slave quarters adjacent to the master's room, was designed for proximity, not comfort. Archaeologists have found smaller, windowless chambers connected by narrow doors to the owner's sleeping area. Proximity was power, distance was privilege. Roman law had words for every transaction of flesh. A master who impregnated his slave did not commit adultery. The child was born a slave, automatically his property. The law turned violence into inheritance. Even when a mistress freed a girl to save face, the freedwoman remained bound as liberta, owing service, loyalty, and silence. The empire turned biology into bureaucracy. Flesh produced wealth, offspring preserved lineage, ownership became hereditary. The boundary between house and market dissolved. Historians estimate that in elite households, 1 in 4 female slaves served as personal attendants, roles that often blurred into sexual servitude. Some were trained for elegance, others for obedience, but all were chosen for availability. Their silence was the system's most reliable currency. The philosopher Seneca once wrote, "He who commands the body commands the soul." He meant it metaphorically. Rome took it literally. To possess someone physically was to prove moral superiority. Power was not only to rule, but to enter, reshape, and claim what was human. Yet the system depended on denial. Rome prided itself on virtus, manly virtue, discipline, self-control. But the same culture that praised restraint institutionalized exploitation. The contradiction was not hidden, it was normalized. The more refined the rhetoric of virtue, the more invisible the violence that sustained it. In poems and graffiti, the enslaved female body appears constantly but never as subject. She is the backdrop to conquest, the symbol of luxury, the ornament of peace. Her existence was the evidence of power, not of life. But sometimes, fragments speak. In a tomb inscription from Ostia, a freedwoman named Chrysis left a message to her former mistress. "I served faithfully, though my heart was never mine." A sentence that compresses an empire's psychology. Loyalty extracted from loss. The intimacy of power served a larger function. It taught complicity. The same men who violated their slaves presided over temples of chastity. The same women who ordered beatings spoke of modesty and family honor. Rome didn't see contradiction. It saw balance, pain and pleasure, domination and piety. Each reinforced the other. To the enslaved, intimacy was another form of surveillance. Every gesture could be read, every silence misinterpreted. A girl learned to perform docility with precision, to anticipate moods, to make herself indispensable but unthreatening. The price of misreading desire was ruin. Even within this darkness, fragments of resistance survived. Some women used their proximity to gain favor, to secure manumission, to free their children. Others used tenderness as strategy, turning affection into survival. But even that agency existed inside the cage, not beyond it. Rome's poets liked to imagine that love conquered all. In truth, love in Rome was conquest refined. the language of empire whispered in private rooms. It was never mutual, it was managerial. The master's desire confirmed hierarchy, the slave's silence maintained it. The paradox was complete. The same civilization that carved marble statues of ideal beauty also built an invisible industry of exploitation. The female body was both muse and merchandise, sacred and taxable, adored and disposable. For centuries, historians have described this as domestic life. But the household was not domestic. It was imperial in miniature. Every act of touch repeated the logic of empire: control, consumption, compliance. And when morning came, the girls returned to routine, combing the mistress's hair, folding linen, fetching water, as if the night before had never happened. Rome didn't erase its sins. It trained them to look civilized. Because in the empire's moral arithmetic, even desire had a price, and the receipt was written on human skin. Next comes silence, the ritual that followed intimacy, when memory itself was outlawed and forgetting became the last form of obedience. Every empire has its anthem. Rome's was silence. After the chains, the lash, and the bed came the quiet, the ritual that sustained the entire system. The empire didn't need to erase the enslaved. It trained them to erase themselves. What law began, habit completed. In the Roman household, silence was not absence. It was policy. The perfect slave was invisible, speaking only when ordered, breathing only when permitted. Words became dangerous because they could mean memory, and memory was subversion. The philosopher Plutarch once wrote, "The well-ordered home is one where voices are few." He meant discipline. The state understood this better than he did. Silence was Rome's hidden infrastructure, faster than armies, stronger than walls. It turned domination into normalcy. Children of slaves grew up inside that vacuum. They learned Latin before they learned their mother's tongues, reciting their master's prayers instead of their own. Generations passed without lineage, each one starting from nothing, because remembering who you were meant remembering you didn't belong. The empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered continuity. Inside villas, silence was performed like religion. A nod replaced a name, a glance replaced speech. Commands flowed downward, obedience flowed upward. The smallest sound out of turn could cost a life, or worse, attention. For an enslaved girl, being noticed was rarely reward. Roman law encouraged this muteness. Slaves couldn't testify in court except under torture. Their word was legally worthless. To make them speak, Rome had to hurt them. It was written in the Digest of Justinian. The testimony of slaves shall not be received unless the body bears witness through pain. The state itself declared, truth required agony. Inscriptions and graffiti reveal the emotional cost. Scrawled lines like, Taccio quia timeo, I am silent because I am afraid, appear in servant quarters. Archaeologists have found scratched marks resembling tally lines, thought to count days of labor or lashes. Silence became arithmetic, but silence was also weapon. The enslaved learned to use it, to withhold reactions, to confuse those who demanded control. Masters sought confession, fear, gratitude. Silence denied them all. It was the only rebellion Rome couldn't legislate, the refusal to give the oppressor a response. Still, even this defiance was fragile. One wrong moment, one glance mistaken for insolence could mean ruin. So silence evolved into self-erasure, the body present, the mind hidden. Some girls survived decades this way, obedient, quiet, enduring, until even they could no longer separate fear from discipline. Rome praised this as virtue. In manuals of household management, writers described the ideal servant as mutus et fidelis, mute and faithful. The words were meant as compliment. They were, in truth, an obituary written for the living. Silence reached beyond the home. In temples, enslaved attendants prepared offerings, but could not pray aloud. In funerals, they carried torches, but could not mourn. The empire's grandeur depended on the silence of those who built it, and on the silence of those who watched. And so, the ritual became circular. Masters silenced slaves, citizens silenced guilt, historians silenced contradiction. Only archaeology broke the spell. Every shackle dug from earth is a sentence the empire forgot to erase. A tablet from the Bay of Naples bears the inscription, "For the quiet house, the gods are kind." Perhaps they were. Quiet houses made rich masters. Quiet slaves made strong empires. But every quiet house was a graveyard of voices. The most profound cruelty of Rome was not that it punished rebellion, but that it destroyed the need to rebel. The empire didn't just rule through fear. It taught people to mistake submission for peace. And so the silence deepened, not forced anymore, but chosen, inherited, perfected. The sound of empire became the absence of sound. Yet even that silence wasn't eternal. In the ruins of Pompeii, in a servant's room no larger than a closet, archaeologists found a scratched Latin line, "Tacui diu, nunc loquor." I was silent long, now I speak. 2,000 years later, we are the ones hearing her, because silence may sustain power, but it cannot survive excavation. When the earth opens, memory returns, and the voices Rome buried begin to whisper again, faint, fractured, unstoppable. Next comes freedom, or what Rome pretended to call freedom, the illusion of mercy written in marble, and the final act of the empire's moral theatre. Rome loved to call itself the cradle of law and the giver of freedom. But in truth, freedom in the empire was not justice restored, it was obedience rewarded. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, sounded merciful. The word itself, from manus, hand, and mitera, to send forth, meant to release from one's hand. But in Rome, that hand never truly opened. Every freedom granted was tethered to the power that gave it. The legal process was elegant, almost theatrical. A master brought his slave before a magistrate, laid a hand on her head, and declared, "I wish this woman to be free." The magistrate struck the slave lightly with a rod and pronounced her liberated. On paper, it was a miracle, the transformation from property to person. But, in practice, it was an exchange of obligations, not a severing of them. Once freed, the woman became liberta, a freed woman, yet the law bound her to her former master, now called patronus. She owed him loyalty, labor, and respect. He could still summon her, demand services, or claim a share of her income. Even her children inherited this duty. The empire turned freedom into another form of taxation. Few slaves ever reached this point. The cost of manumission was often set at a price no one could pay. A woman might work decades to buy herself. only to discover that her master could refuse at will. For those freed in a will, liberty arrived only after the master's death. A final gesture of control, ensuring gratitude from beyond the grave. And yet, Rome praised these gestures as virtue. Emperors staged mass manumissions during festivals, freeing hundreds at once to display generosity. The crowd cheered, the freed wept, but none could forget who had owned them. Freedom was never theirs. It was proof of their master's magnanimity. Inscriptions across the empire celebrate these paradoxes. One reads, "To the divine Augustus who gave me liberty." Another, "Freed through the mercy of my lady, Livia." And even in stone, the language of freedom was written in the grammar of submission. The economic machinery continued beneath the symbolism. Freed women often returned to the same homes as paid servants. Their wages, recorded in papyri, were deductions from their debt of gratitude. They were free enough to work, but not free enough to refuse. A few used the system to climb higher. Some managed small shops, others became midwives, hairdressers, or tutors. A rare few, like the freedwoman Neaevaleia Taish of Pompeii, amassed wealth and built their own tombs. Her epitaph still stands. She earned her freedom with honor and built this monument by her own means. Yet, even there, the inscription ends with the name of her former master, a reminder that freedom never erased ownership, only reframed it. For most, liberty was fragile. The Lex Fufia Caninia and Lex Alia Sentia imposed strict limits. Only a certain number of slaves could be freed, depending on the owner's total. Freedom itself was rationed. The law ensured that mercy never disrupted the market. And what of those too poor, too young, or too defiant to be freed? Their hope was myth, their endurance the only legacy. Rome's poets romanticized them as loyal servants rewarded for devotion. Reality was quieter. Most died nameless, buried without inscription, their bones reused in mass graves. Freedom in Rome wasn't a right, it was an instrument. It kept hope alive just long enough to preserve obedience. The promise of manumission made submission profitable. It replaced revolt with patience. The state didn't fear rebellion when the enslaved believed their master might one day set them free. This was the empire's psychological genius. It sold hope as another form of control. The same system that chained children could call itself merciful because it sometimes unlocked the door. For a few, at the right moment, under the right audience. The result was a civilization that mistook ceremony for conscience. Rome believed itself just because it knew how to stage virtue. And yet, scattered through the records, a few voices resisted the performance. One freedwoman left a defiant epitaph. "No one gave me liberty. I took it." Her stone was smaller, her name forgotten, but her sentence outlived the empire, because what Rome called freedom was never the opposite of slavery. It was its most sophisticated disguise. Next comes the reckoning, not from poets or senators, but from the earth itself. When marble lies, bone corrects it. When words lie, matter tells the truth. Rome's poets glorified conquest. Its jurists justified it. But beneath every marble floor, another archive waited, written not in Latin, but in calcium and ash. Archaeology, not rhetoric, became the empire's true historian. Across Italy, excavations reveal a quiet ledger of the enslaved. shallow graves behind villas, bones marked by labor, teeth worn by malnutrition, spines twisted from endless carrying. The earth testifies in fractures where paper offered praise. At Herculaneum, 20 skeletons of young women were found in a servant corridor, their hands covering their faces. They were not burned in the eruption of Vesuvius. They suffocated there, waiting for orders. Their bones show stunted growth, repeated fractures, and calcium loss consistent with childhood malnutrition. Each injury is an unpaid debt recorded in flesh. In Pompeii, graffiti scrawled on service walls read, "Serva fui, et tacui." I was a slave, and I was silent. The handwriting is shaky, carved with a nail or broken tile. It is the only autobiography some ever left. The empire preserved their bodies by accident, their stories by neglect. Outside the city, near the villa of Diomedes, archaeologists unearthed iron chains attached to wall rings in underground chambers. They weren't dungeons for criminals. They were storage rooms for servants who worked, slept, and sometimes died below ground. Their skeletal wrists still bear the telltale abrasion of shackles. Rome's architecture of elegance concealed an anatomy of pain. Inscriptions reveal what law omitted. Funerary tablets list the freed and the faithful. To my servant Chione, who served without fault. To Phyle, my beloved maid, who was as loyal as she was silent. The tone is affectionate, almost tender, but that tenderness itself is domination, a love written from the master's perspective. The enslaved never got to choose the words engraved for them. At the necropolis of Isola Sacra, hundreds of tombs hold freedmen and freedwomen, those who survived servitude long enough to earn a name in stone. Yet, their epitaphs still bind them to their patrons. Marcus, freedman of Gaius; Helena, freed woman of Livia. Even in death, their identities remained borrowed. The grave became the last receipt of ownership. Bones also tell what inscriptions conceal. Analysis of skeletons from Roman villas shows that enslaved women often died younger than men, many before the age of 30. Repeated pregnancies, poor diet, and physical strain left visible traces. Enlarged joints, pelvic trauma, anemia. They lived and died building comfort for others. In the port city of Ostia, mass burial pits contain dozens of young female skeletons buried without markers. Their teeth reveal traces of lead poisoning, common among domestic slaves forced to grind makeup pigments and handle amphorae of wine sealed with lead stoppers. Rome's beauty, its cosmetics, its silverware, its marble polish, was literally lethal to those who created it. Even silence left material evidence. In a cellar beneath a patrician house, an archaeologist found a small terracotta lamp scratched with 2 letters, LV, perhaps the initials of a servant. It lay beneath layers of ash beside a broken jug. A small, anonymous mark, but one that insists someone was here, someone mattered. Historians long praised Rome's infrastructure, the aqueducts, the amphitheatres, the baths, but those stones are inseparable from the bodies that carried them. The same empire that mastered engineering also mastered erasure. Its perfection depended on forgetting who built it. The contrast between monument and skeleton is unbearable. Marble gods above, bent spines below. The more eternal the stone, the more temporary the life beneath it. Rome's greatness was geological, It buried its cost deep enough to look clean, and yet the ground never stopped speaking. Every excavation tears open a moral wound. A child's bracelet in a drain, a dented collar, a fragment of pottery with the word domina etched beside a crude figure of a kneeling woman. These artifacts do not accuse, they record. They are ledgers of the forgotten, rediscovered, one shard at a time. For centuries, historians wrote of empire as progress, roads, law, culture. But bones remember differently. They preserve not triumphs, but transactions. Every scar a unit of value, every fracture a coin in Rome's moral economy. In one villa near Naples, excavators found a tag tied to a skeleton's ankle, engraved with a single phrase, Pro domo mea, for my house. It was not decoration, it was bookkeeping. Rome's monuments promised eternity, its bones delivered the bill. Because in the end, marble is propaganda, only bone tells the truth. And in that truth lies the empire's final confession. Civilization was never built on order. It was built on silence, cemented by suffering, and counted in human remains. Next comes the reckoning, the moral arithmetic of empire itself, where the ledgers close, and we ask what survived of Rome, its glory or its guilt. Every civilization writes two histories, one for glory and one for accounting. Rome perfected both. Its monuments told the story of conquest. Its ledgers told the cost. The empire documented everything: tributes, rations, taxes, weights, births, deaths. Nothing escaped bureaucracy, not even pain. In this way, cruelty became measurable, and oppression became a matter of record. The Romans didn't hide the machinery, they admired it. To them, administration was the highest form of reason. When Pliny wrote, "What the barbarians destroy, we catalogue," he meant it as praise. The empire's genius was to turn domination into documentation. Each census recorded slaves alongside livestock and property. Their existence inflated the empire's wealth. A nobleman's prestige wasn't in virtue, but in ownership. The more bodies he controlled, the greater his rank. Power wasn't invisible, it was countable. The state treated human lives as numbers to be maintained. When populations declined after wars or epidemics, Rome didn't question morality, it questioned supply. Records show the empire importing captives from Gaul, Numidia, and Cappadocia to stabilize labor. It was logistics, not cruelty. Every triumphal procession that entered the forum carried its victims first. Captives paraded in chains, labeled by province, brought from Britain, taken from Judea. They were not individuals, they were proof of efficiency. The historian Tacitus observed that Rome creates deserts and calls them peace. He meant more than war. The empire erased people, then recorded the emptiness as order. In its legal texts, the price of a human life was exact. A strong male slave could fetch up to 6,000 sesterces. A trained girl, more. Damaging another man's slave required compensation, the same principle as breaking his ox. Justice was arithmetic. One wax tablet found in Egypt lists monthly accounts. 2 girl slaves. Maintenance, 4 denarii each. Laundry, 1 denarius. Physician, 2. Beneath it, a note in smaller script. 1 fell ill, deducted from pay. The cruelty is not in the act, It's in the calmness of the handwriting. Rome called this civilization, and in a way it was. Order, calculation, and permanence, qualities modern institutions still admire, were all born from this moral architecture. What was once recorded on clay and parchment now survives in our laws and ledgers. To build a world without chaos, Rome quantified humanity. It turned bodies into assets, morality into policy. The empire didn't just conquer, it audited existence. But buried within this precision lies the greatest illusion. That order equals justice. Rome believed the world could be ruled if everything had a price. It created stability through measurement, forgetting that what can be counted can also be excused. By counting bodies, Rome erased souls. And yet, the ledgers still betray their makers. The same columns that tracked wealth also track decay. Archaeologists found notes of shortages, too many deaths, too few births, too many freed women dying young. The numbers themselves whisper collapse, because no empire can survive its own arithmetic. When power measures everything, it eventually measures itself. The irony is cruel. The bureaucracy that built Rome also foretold its end. Every tax record, every population list, every shipment of slaves was evidence of a system too perfect to feel. Control became the only morality, and efficiency the only faith. Modern eyes still marvel at Rome's organization, its engineering, its law. But read the ledgers closely, and the pattern is unmistakable. The higher the precision, the deeper the cruelty. Every column of numbers hides a body, every total a scream reduced to zero. In the end, the empire's genius was not its conquests, it was its accounting. It found a way to sanctify exploitation through order, to turn suffering into structure, and to call both civilization. When the last scribe closed the last ledger, he probably believed he had written eternity. Instead, he had written a confession. Because Rome's greatness wasn't only measured in marble or coin, but in the unacknowledged mathematics of pain. Next comes the collapse, the slow erosion of illusion, when the empire's own logic devours itself and the numbers stop adding up. Rome did not fall in a single day. It fell in the mind first, long before its walls cracked, before the barbarians crossed the frontiers, before the marble flaked into dust. The empire collapsed the moment it mistook efficiency for virtue and law for morality. By the 3rd century, the machine had consumed itself. The ledgers grew heavier, the harvests thinner, the slaves fewer. Conquests no longer brought profit, they brought mouths to feed. For the first time in centuries, the empire's arithmetic stopped working. The signs were everywhere. Records show shortages of labor and rising prices of slaves. Birth rates fell among free citizens as wealth concentrated into fewer hands. Villas once filled with servants turned quiet. Their courtyards echoed with absence. The empire had optimized itself into decay. It had built an economy that required suffering to function. When there were no new wars to supply captives, the system faltered. The Romans had enslaved so perfectly that they could no longer imagine a world without it. And so, when the supply of victims slowed, the empire began to starve, not from hunger, but from habit. The philosopher Augustine, writing as the Western Empire crumbled, saw the paradox. They made law their god, and in the worship of order forgot mercy. He wasn't describing theology, He was describing bureaucracy. Rome's greatest achievement had become its spiritual failure. Even as cities emptied, officials kept recording. Censuses continued to count corpses as population. Tax collectors demanded coin from towns already abandoned. Inscriptions praising imperial virtue still appeared, chiseled by slaves who no longer believed in what they built. The illusion of control persisted after control was gone. By the 5th century, entire provinces functioned as ruins that still paid taxes. The empire existed mostly on paper, its power reduced to receipts. The administrative perfection that once ruled continents became a ghost haunting its own documents. And yet, Rome did not see itself as dying. It believed decline was merely inefficiency, solvable through new decrees, new punishments, new faiths. But no law can repair a system built on exhaustion. When everything has been taken, bodies, labor, hope, nothing remains to extract. The final generations of slaves outlived the empire that owned them. The system that measured them, punished them, and recorded them collapsed under the weight of its own ledgers. Their chains rusted as the statues fell. Archaeology shows that in the last decades, villas shrank, mosaics went unfinished, fountains dried. The empire's grandeur decomposed quietly, like a body that refused to admit death. But history's cruelty is irony. The empire that worshipped permanence was undone by its own perfection. A machine built to count could not comprehend what could not be counted: dignity, mercy, meaning. When the balance sheets failed to align, Rome had no language left except silence. The final inscriptions sound almost defensive. To the eternal city. Roma invicta, Rome unconquered. But eternity had already ended in thought. What remained was habit, stone repeating itself after faith was gone. Even as barbarians entered the city, the Senate met as usual. They debated taxes, titles, ceremonies. No one declared the empire dead, because no empire ever does. It simply forgets what life felt like before paperwork replaced conscience. In that sense, Rome never vanished. It lives wherever law is mistaken for justice, wherever bureaucracy becomes belief, wherever suffering is organized so cleanly that it looks civilized. The ruins are not the tragedy, they are the mirror. They remind us that intelligence without empathy is not order, but entropy, and that the most dangerous empires are not those that fall by force, but those that fall inward, into logic, into procedure, into silence. The bones beneath the marble do not mourn Rome's fall. They vindicate it. For the first time, the system that measured them has no numbers left. The ledger is blank. And what remains, fragments of pottery, inscriptions half erased, is not evidence of glory. It is evidence of a question still unanswered. Can civilization survive its own success? Next comes the last act, the reckoning of legacy. When we ask what Rome truly left us, its architecture or its psychology. Rome fell, but its logic survived. Every empire since has inherited its most enduring invention, not roads, not aqueducts, not law, but the idea that power must appear rational to be eternal. Rome taught the world that cruelty could be civilized if written neatly, that a whip with a signature hurts less than a sword without one. That domination, when measured and recorded, becomes governance. The empire's marble crumbled, but its psychology became the blueprint for every bureaucracy that followed. We still speak in its vocabulary: order, discipline, stability, civilization. The words that once justified chains now justify systems. The ledger has changed mediums, from wax tablets to spreadsheets, but its moral arithmetic remains. What matters is still what can be counted. When modern governments draft census forms, when corporations calculate human resources, when economies define value through labor instead of life, they echo Rome's creed: efficiency first, empathy later, if at all. The philosopher Foucault once called this the empire of the visible, a world where control no longer needs cruelty because compliance has become culture. We do not fear punishment, we internalize it. We police ourselves more efficiently than any master ever could. Rome began that conversion, from external violence to internal discipline. That is its true immortality. Look closely at the ruins, the arches, the inscriptions, the symmetry. They're not just architecture, they're ideology in stone. Every column proclaims balance, proportion, reason. But beneath that symmetry lay the most asymmetrical equation in history: one Rome, millions enslaved. The geometry of beauty concealed the algebra of ownership. Even our modern monuments carry the same grammar: white facades, symmetrical halls, seals of law and authority. The aesthetic of order remains seductive because it promises peace, just as Rome once did. But peace built on hierarchy is only a quieter form of war. The big question lingers: can civilization exist without someone paying its price? Rome answered yes, because it learned to hide the payment. The empire died, but its method of forgetting did not. We inherit not its tyranny, but its indifference, the ability to separate prosperity from the suffering that makes it possible. Archaeology uncovers bones, but we must excavate psychology. Every hierarchy we build, every system that prizes stability over justice, replays Rome's equation in new terms. When we admire order without asking who maintains it, when we praise progress without measuring its victims, we speak Latin without knowing it. That is why Rome never truly ended. It globalized. Its ruins live inside our institutions, our economies, our languages. Its gods are gone, but its habits remain. To measure humanity, to bureaucratize pain, to call that structure virtue. The women who served, the girls who were sold, the children who died nameless, they are not footnotes to civilization. They are its foundation. Rome's marble endures because their bones did. And now, 2,000 years later, the question returns, not to the Senate, but to us. When our own empires collapse, what will the bones say? Will they say we were wiser? Or will they whisper, as Rome's still do, that we confused order with justice, silence with peace, and progress with mercy? Civilization begins where memory does not fail. To remember the enslaved is not to condemn the past, it is to rescue the present from repeating it. Because when the ledger closes and the marble fades and the archives turn to dust, the bones will still speak, and they will ask, as they asked of Rome, who paid for your perfection?